A couple of years ago, I began my road back to Mordheim proper by making a video where I showed you how I made some townhouses for Mordheim. I did, however, fail to provide any plans or blueprints. My bad. Since that first townhouse video, I have added to my library of Mordheim Terrain, and I have hosted numerous Mordheim games in my home. However, I've noticed that my old townhouses rarely, if ever, get to see any action on the tabletop. Even though I love my old townhouses, it was clear to me that there were opportunities of improvement. At the same time, in a rather serendipitous way, the good folks over at Creality sent me their new tool to play around with, the Falcon 2 Pro laser cutter and engraver. No more excuses. It is time to make Townhouse 2.0. Hey folks, my name is Leif and I want to welcome you to my channel called DEVSANDDICE, where I paint miniatures or craft awesome terrain for the tabletop. In today's video, I'm going to show you the steps I took to make a better version of my previous townhouse build. Before we get into it, I want to ask you a small favor. If you like the content I make, then please consider subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but it means the world for the future of this channel. Thank you. With that out of the way, let's get into it. The Creality Falcon2 Pro features an air purifier, a fully transparent 360-degree cover to prevent laser leakage, safety features like flame and dirt monitoring, and a manual stop to halt any process you might have running. In short, it made me feel very safe and secure. The software called Lightburn integrates well with Adobe Illustrator, and I can copy-paste any design I have come up with. The Falcon 2 Pro comes with a built-in top camera for accurate alignment, which is very nice when you want to be very precise with your positioning. I have the 22-watt laser module, and it cuts through most materials we wargamers would use quite quickly and effectively, like this 3mm hardboard. It's a premium tool to have, and I have to say that the results are fabulous, and this will save my aching shoulders from having to cut any more bases in the future. A lesson I took from old builds was that the base was not going to be square. Well, at least not straight square. Like you can see, this base is purposely rounded, and I think it's 12.5 degrees or something like that. I start by gluing in some coffee stir sticks at the edges with some hot glue just to expedite the process a little bit faster. Now once I have that edge, then I can use white glue, which is my preferred glue. And in the end, I basically have the middle, which I did quite nicely cut in some custom fit coffee stir sticks to provide the planking for the bottom floor of our new townhouse. The reason why I have this curved design is twofold. One, it actually does look a lot more medieval Europe because they didn't have Chicago-style gridded streets. And second of all, it does actually provide a much more interesting game design experience with shooting lanes that are not straight. Here you can see that I've actually done some plans, and here I'm cutting out part of it on some cardstock. And I have to say, it's quite convenient to cut this out on the Falcon 2 Pro because it goes so fast. That was actually real time. It literally cuts it in front of your eyes, and in seconds you have perfectly cut pieces. Now this I'm gonna be using for the parts that are gonna have brickwork, and I like often to mix brickwork and the more wattle and daub looking plastered walls, just because it gives a house more character and more visual variation. As you can see, I'm using hot glue to glue in that template, which I linked together using some masking tape. Here and there, I also have to remember to glue in the actual separate walls because this is a townhouse with 3 separate apartments, I guess, or houses. Now, at the back, I thought it was a little bit boring with it being entirely open, so I glued in small bits there. And the game designer in me, of course, thought about, well, if I'm going to have these bits, they need to be somehow a little bit different. More on that later. Now I'm gluing in some 5mm balsa dowels at the edges. This will help me just to make sure that all of the brickwork, which has been done previously with my Proxon, and all of my bricks are 1 centimeter times 5mm times 5mm. So that's not realistic scale, but it looks realistic enough, I feel it. And I know that a lot of people feel like, why am I doing individual bricks? But to me, that looks the best. It looks much more organic. Now, when you do this, at the bottom row, I really recommend that you use hot glue. Once you have one row, then you can use white glue to stack on top of that. And here we go. So we have one 75% cover, one 50% cover, and one full cover. There is a difference, which means that from a tactical point of view, when you are thinking about where should I place my figure, it matters. And here you can see that the actual footprint of this building is also quite small, but I wanted to expand the second floor and above. So I've just done a little guide that has a 1-inch offset just as a template for myself and the beams I'm gonna try to get in there. I want to get back a little bit about choices and so on in wargaming. It's not that different from computer game design. I would argue that any good game design, and I'm gonna quote Sid Meier here, but he said something that has been a guiding light to me, and I think it rings true in so many ways. I think he said something, and I'm paraphrasing here perhaps, that a game is a collection of interesting choices. And when is a choice interesting? Well, at least in my book, there has to be a risk-reward element to everything that you do. And I guess what I mean to say by this is that if you have the choice to do, for instance, covers on the backside of a townhouse, make the covers different, make them different good, so that a player gets to have an interesting choice where to put their models. As you see, this template of mine really made it quite easy for me to make the floor of the second floor. And it looks quite nice once I got that template paper off, and I was very happy with this result, and it looks like it was done with some skill by the craftsmen of the old world once upon a time. Now, one thing that it sort of bothered me a little bit, I wanted to have something in the openings there. I didn't want to have doors because I want the openings to be, well, openings because I want them to be used, right? So I glued in a little bit of cardstock to the bevel the doors. Here I'm just adding some sand texture just to make sure that the walls on the bottom floor gets a nice stucco texture. Here I'm just getting rid of some material just to make sure that this has a snug fit to the floor that I've done. And once I felt confident enough, and it goes quite quickly in this video, but I can assure you that I dry fitted this plenty of times before I committed to it. But you know what? It turned out pretty darn good. And like that, we now have the first floor and the beginning of the second floor that is ejecting out 1 inch. Now, once I have that second floor, I started with defining really the edge with a couple of bricks, because then that meant that, oh, I have a nice line where I can glue the rest of that cut out paper, and then once I have that, I can glue on the rest of the bricks. Now it gets a little bit more interesting. I'm going to use foam core like I normally do for my stucco walls. I did want to use the Falcon 2 Pro, but in all honesty, I haven't figured out the magic formula to cut out a foam core yet. Foam core is a tricky thing because it's paper and then there is a little bit of XPS foam and then there's paper. And I think I know what's wrong, and it isn't anything with the Falcon 2 Pro. It is actually with the technology. I'm going to try out with some dark foam core because apparently that will cut more evenly than white foam core, because that stuff just bounces off apparently. More on that in future videos, hopefully. Here I started with combining and doing those hinge techniques that I usually do, but in all honesty I figured out that it would be easier for me to just take one piece at a time, because that curvature of the house, it's at least hard for me to count on that. So I took the middle piece first and then I glued on the right piece. Basically what I'm saying here is make sure that you do this one by one, because otherwise chances are that the measurements in the plans are not 100% correct. So always dry fit. I do plenty of errors. I try to do my best to make sure that the plans are perfect, but you'll see later in this process that I actually changed some of my plans, which I encourage you to do also. Always be critical about what you're building and think about all of the different ways you can change it. Here I'm gluing in the walls for the middle section, and these will be marked clearly in the plans that should be in the description down below, just so you know. So if you want to build this, you can. Here I just wanted to show you how you make sure that wood grain from balsa dowels pops, and you use a steel brush and just run it up and down the actual natural grain, and it makes it look quite nice. So these are hot glued into the build, and I use the same 5mm dowels. I'm not sure if I've grown away from the 8mm dowels I used once upon a time, but I figured this time I'm going to be a little bit more consistent. I'm essentially using 2 pieces of wood, that is the 5mm balsa dowels, and then some coffee stir sticks. Now, one of the things I was really excited about was, probably too much, was the fact that I could design my own windows in Illustrator. And this is just some of the examples I came up with. I literally spent, I don't know, 15-20 minutes just to come up with some designs that looked somewhat medieval. And I have to say, being able to look through that protective red glass and see how the machine cuts everything out, oh, it was beautiful. The design is really quite simple. Visually, I wanted something that could have looked like it was medieval, but I also wanted a certain depth, right? And these are made from board, which is 3mm thick. So 3 layers on top of each other equals 9mm, and the foam core I use is about 5mm. So these will actually jet out a couple of millimeters on both sides, which is something I really like because it becomes a defined edge. And here I haven't even glued them in. They fit so snugly because, go figure, they were perfectly cut. But I hot glued them in just to make sure that they're not gonna get anywhere. Then I took care of the inner wall for the bricked part there. Then I started laying in the beams for the 3rd and 4th floor, and these are using some of those 5mm square dowels that I'm talking about. One aspect that one doesn't bring up that I'm trying to show here is that the higher the floor is, the less walk space I have. That is so that if you fall down 2 inches, i.e. 1 floor, then you'll land on the floor underneath you. And also, it makes it a heck of a lot easier to place ladders. This is just me trying to be a nice game designer. With the beams in place, I finished up any decorative coffee stir sticks timber, and then I added some of that sand texture to all of the stucco panels. It looks quite nice. And again, I want to re-emphasize that my way of thinking is that if you want to put a ladder in any of these floors, the floor above should have less space, i.e. the ladder should be leaning forwards. As you can see, getting the wood flooring using those coffee stir sticks goes quite quickly, and the next job was to start defining the actual roofs. Now, one interesting thing here is that, of course, it's a ruined building, right? So some of the planking on the roofs needs to go as well. But I wanted to make sure that these were good shooting positions, because otherwise, why bother? And I don't know if it's clear for all of you, but functionality or design, game design specifically, is very important for me. So if something doesn't have a function, then I question its existence. One example is this. These two corners, why would the wall be there? If you had warbands in Mordheim and they got stuck in one of those cells, they would want to get the heck out. And since this is wattle and daub houses, if you have a good axe, well, then you've created some nice pathways. And here you can see me applying the same thinking to the side. Here I'm just gluing in some of the beams that will later be the actual boards for the roof for that middle section. And I particularly liked that middle section of the way I did it, just because, and here is a point where I'm not thinking about game design, but I'm thinking more about visuals. I liked the silhouette it creates because it's a very sharp silhouette against the sky. So I really fell in love with that. Similar to the other roofs, I'm gonna come in with some coffee stir sticks and cut them to shape to create what remains of the middle roof. Now, another thing that I wanted to do was shingles, and you've seen me do shingles before, but by God, this machine is amazing to cut shingles. And another cool feature is with the Falcon 2 Pro is that it has this tray which gathers all of the smaller cuts nicely, and just look at the cuts, they're perfect. And the thing is, at first I was a little bit, well, they're perfect, I wonder if that's gonna look good. But I guess the genius part of this is, well, they're perfect, but they're still going to be placed there by a human. So you're going to have a little bit of organic feel to it. They won't be 100% in line and perfect. I have to say that I've done these types of shingles once, I think, before with scissors, and it was a pain in the backside. I've never done these, I think they're called snakeskin shingles, and I'm sorry, I just fell in love with how easy it was, and those designs was something I did in Illustrator, and again, I think those were made in, what, 2 minutes, and then just duplicate, and then copy-paste into Lightburn, and boom, the machine just goes. So for me, you can expect that most of my future shingles will be laser cut. They look quite amazing. And it's going to save me a lot of time. And also, I mentioned earlier, my shoulders, I'm getting older, and I do have some shoulder issues. I've visited a physical therapist, I think it's called, and I need to do some exercises and whatnot because my shoulders are not what they were 20 or so years ago. So this machine actually is a lifesaver for me. As per usual, I'm priming all of this using my airbrush with Vallejo black primer, and then I come over that with a little bit of white ink to do a zenithal prime, which defines where light and shadows are. I love this step when you've primed it and you're doing your first zenithal, because now you start to see the build for what it is, not the different materials with their specific colors. The next step is to cover this entire thing with transparent burnt umber. Now, my logic is that everything is either made of wood or it's dirty because there's been a mild disaster and apocalypse, so everything gets brown. Here I'm stippling in some dark gray hobby paints on the bricking, and again I'm stippling it in. I don't want to cover all of the brown that exists on the brick because I want to create a more organic looking brick. Light gray I actually dry brush on the entire thing. What, Leif? Are you crazy? No, on the entire thing, meaning all of the wood, all of the bricks, everything. However, make sure that you're doing it from the right direction. When it comes to the wood planking, it's not as finicky because wood tends to turn more grayish as it ages, so that's fine and dandy, but it should look something like so. Here I'm gonna use a little bit of hobby paint and a little bit of miniature paints actually to start painting in those panels, and I wanted one to be red, and here you can see that I'm wet blending in those two colors. And for the hobby paint I use plenty of flow improver to make it easier to wet blend. And the second one to the right is gonna be more green, and again I'm using some of Army Painter's paints because they are naturally take a little bit longer to dry, which makes them quite good to do wet blending. Now for the interior and the middle section, I went with my classical flesh tone beige and light brown, which I find is a good color for, I guess, weathered white. This was white once upon a time, believe it or not, but it sort of, with the years, it became more yellow brown-ish. And I do the inside of that in the same color. I went on an Army Painter spree here, and I tried to get my own dark blue sea mixture, which was those two paints, and it wasn't that difficult actually. It was essentially the blue with a dash of black. Now for the window frames, I'm gonna go with the good old classic of Leadbelcher, and then I go over some of the shingles and some of the walls with a second coat of dry brushed light gray. Corrosion texture is a thing from AK which I really like because it creates a nice texture on anything metal. So I use this primarily on the window frames, but you can also use this if you feel that any part of your build is missing some texture. Now here's a thing, I'm gonna take some spackle, and this is light spackle we call it in Sweden, and I've diluted this with water. And this might seem strange, but pay close attention to how the brickwork looks like before, and then pay attention to it how it looks after. Because to me, at least, that more brighter in between the grout, so to speak, it looks damn good, and this is just before we've even grimed it down. Now, staple signature thing for me is to have my posters, and I've spoken about this before, but my logic when it comes to posters is put the ones that were there before the disaster first, put them in somewhat straight, and then you put other posters on top of them in a more weird angles. Ryza Rust, and you can use any orange paint to be honest, but I dry brush that on the iron window frames. Strong tone is my go-to when it comes to weathering down the buildings. And here I'm using a little bit of white ink to create some nice graffiti. And here I'm even thinking about who would reach that. Well, obviously a Skaven. So think about those things. Create small stories here and there. I see this as an opportunity to make your terrain piece more personal. Now, obviously, the graffiti that came in after the first griming stage looks a little bit bright white, so you might want to knock that down with a second coat of some strong tone here and there. And the final part is True Blood, which I use through the airbrush, but here I'm just using the actual air of the airbrush, and I'm using a brush to propel blood here and there. And I think that's where we're gonna look at the final result. I'm super stoked with this building, both from a visual point of view, but also from a design point of view. I can see this one getting used so much more than my old townhouses. I want to take this opportunity to thank my patrons for their support, and as normal, a special shout out goes to my champion and legend level patrons. So thank you so much Agrisomnia, Andreas Winberg, Arjen Angenent, Bo Ahlgren, Fredrik Kiersgaard Lund, Gunnar Byström, Jason Chastain, Lawrence Davis, Madners, Magnus Solberg, Teddy, Urban, What I Got to Roll, Anton Hand, Battle Corgi V7, Niklas Swedenlind, Oliver Granlund, Steven Carpenter, and the Elder Kind. Thank you so much, good people. You are awesome. Now I know some of you will think that, oh, you use the laser cutter, blah blah blah, but here is actually a second building. Looks quite similar, but a little bit different. I did this side by side using the normal tools. The only thing I have is one laser cut window in the middle top there. But other than that, it was made with the convention tools that I've used before. I really love these two buildings. They show a lot of gameplay opportunities and they can be connected to other buildings, because that's one of the things that I'm a stickler for. I want a building to show opportunities. Opportunities of where you can shoot someone from an elevated position, where you can connect one building to another, and that really is what makes Mordheim, in my book, so interesting, both from a gameplay point of view, but also from terrain building, to be honest. I mean, just look at this. You have combat happening at least 3 or 4 verticality levels. For me, this is what Wargaming is about, and I think I will probably harping on this for way too long, but yeah, Mordheim is my jam. I want to thank the good people over at Creality for sending me their wonderful machine, the Falcon 2 Pro, and I foresee that I'm going to be using it quite a lot in my future projects. I want to thank you so much for watching. If you like what you saw, then YouTube recommends that you should check these videos out. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next video.